month of the year.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to episode 30 of Knock Once for Yes.
It isn't quite summer yet, but would you believe the sun is out? It's March and spring has sprung. I felt mad as a March hare this month as Lil and I have both just celebrated another orbit of the sun, and we've been on lots of spooky adventures, from prehistoric caves to castle towers. So Lil, do you want to tell us what's coming up this month?
Coming up today, it's all aboard the ghost train on this paranormal radar, and a man in Gloucestershire suspects his shed might be haunted. We have listener stories from Kelly, Chris and Juliet, and we take another trip across the Fens to Norfolk, where Fitz has an interesting encounter at Thetford Priory, and we risk the wrath of the phantom rabbit at Thetford Warren Lodge.
Before we get into all of that, we'd like to say a huge thank you to our latest patrons:
Jessica Noche,
Zamira Gibb,
Kerry Gleeson,
Thea Ellen,
and Ben Jackson Ling, who kindly upped his pledge.
We'd also like to say a huge thank you to those that have supported us through Coffee:
Portia,
Helen,
Liz P,
Debbie,
and Jess PMKN. We're incredibly grateful to everyone who's donated to support the show. You guys keep us on the air and we couldn't do it without you. Thank you.
Before we move on to our paranormal radar stories, we've got a little bit of follow-up from last episode from one of our listeners.
Yes, Becca got in touch through Instagram when we posted a picture of the Talbot Inn from our last paranormal postcard. She actually stayed at the Talbot and said she found it incredibly creepy. She told us that on one occasion she'd popped into the ensuite to get something, but when she came back, the built-in wardrobe doors were both flung wide open. The doors were heavy wood, so not that easy to move, and her husband wasn't in the room at the time.
Ooh, spooky. I'm so jealous. I really want to stay there myself.
Oh, so am I. I would so desperate to stay there, but thank you, Becca, for getting in touch and telling us your experience. And for any listeners that have visited any of the places that we've been to and we talk about on the show, we'd love to hear from you. If you've been there or if you felt anything, or even if you didn't feel anything, we just love hearing from you. Please do get in touch. Now, Fitz, moving on to the paranormal radar, and what's all this about a haunted shed?
Well, our first paranormal radar story is from the ITV News website, where a man in Gloucestershire was beginning to suspect that his shed might be haunted. He kept finding that items he left out on his workbench were being put away overnight. He was puzzled. Was this some kind of house-proud poltergeist? In an effort to catch the culprit, he set up a video camera viewing the workbench and retired for the night. On reviewing the video the next day, he was in for a bit of a surprise. Now, I'm afraid that those hoping for some amazing evidence of the paranormal are to be disappointed, as the footage revealed that his workbench was being tidied by a rather industrious mouse. It turns out that he'd left a container of peanuts out on the bench with which he would feed the garden birds. Taking a fancy to these, it appears the mouse was simply trying to bury them by covering them up with the items he'd left out on the workbench. I do suggest you watch the video, and I'll put a link to it on the website. It's pretty impressive how this tiny little mouse lifts some of the items, especially when many are bigger, heavier, or both than the little mouse. So, another paranormal blooper, but perhaps one with a lesson for investigators. Sometimes the natural can seem even more implausible than the supernatural.
It certainly is implausible. I mean, the weight of some of these things that the mouse was lifting, I do recommend that people watch the video. It's hilarious. And honestly, if I'd been in that shed and seen all those items on the workbench put away, the last thing I would have thought was the most plausible explanation was that a mouse was tidying them up. It's ridiculous. It was lifting things like a hose connector. It was about twice the size of this little mouse.
Yeah, seeing is believing on this one. I really didn't think it'd be possible for it to lift some of that stuff.
No, and well, I was going to say my first thought in that situation would have been that it was a ghost, but then I realised this is me we're talking about. My first thought is nearly always it was probably a ghost.
And now it's time to board the ghost train, as we have a report of our own from our evening with the wonderful Haunted Heritage at their Ghosts in the Valley event with Ecclesbourne Valley Railway. Regular listeners will remember our interview with Jill and Michelle of the paranormal events company Haunted Heritage from our episode on the Donington Heath Manor House last summer. Well, ever since we did that interview, we've been longing to go on one of their investigations, but they have so many amazing locations, we just couldn't decide which one to choose. Until, that is, we saw that for their latest venture, they teamed up with a heritage railway line.
Now, many of you will know that I have a bit of a love for railway journeys. I probably watch too many old films and think that they're terribly romantic. So the idea of riding a heritage train at night along a haunted railway line, listening to the history and the ghost stories, and stopping off at the stations along the way to investigate using ghost hunting equipment, well, that was an adventure I couldn't pass up, and I booked us some tickets pretty quickly. The Ecclesbourne Valley Railway is a 9-mile-long heritage railway line in the Derbyshire Peak District. England used to be well connected through the railway, with most rural towns and villages having their own station. A lot of these closed after the Second World War, but few of the lines were actually cleared or reused, and most were simply left to be reclaimed by nature. Even today, in many places, you can still see the scars from the railway cuttings tracing through the landscape, the ghostly path of journeys long since past. The Ecclesbourne Valley Railway began life in the market town of Wirksworth in 1865, with a ceremonial cutting of the first sod, for which was procured a silver-plated spade and, wait for it, a wheelbarrow with handles covered in silk velvet. I mean, I know it's quite difficult to jazz up a wheelbarrow, but clearly, what was I thinking? If you've got to do it, then the way to go is to cover the handles in silk velvet.
I don't know why on earth we couldn't have had a silver-plated wheelbarrow as well.
Perhaps that wasn't in the budget. That sounds a bit expensive.
May have been a tad excessive.
It was a well-used Midland railway line up until the Second World War, but in the late 40s use began to decline, and the line was closed to passengers, although it continued to be used for freight haulage until the late 1980s, when the line was permanently shut down and abandoned to its quiet decay. But the actual railway tracks were left intact. Unlike so many others where the material was ripped up and reclaimed, the line was still there, biding its time, holding its stories close, patiently waiting under its thicket of brambles. This meant that there was potential for the line to be cleared and reopened it was after more than a decade of hard work by Wyvern Rail, a community-owned and managed venture established to restore and operate the Duffield to Wirksworth line. Today, we're very lucky to be able to ride this line once more on both steam and diesel heritage trains. So, on a chilly February evening, we headed off to Derbyshire to board a ghost train at Duffield Station. And it turned out to be rather more of a ghost train than we perhaps expected. As we boarded and chose our seats, Michelle from Haunted Heritage wandered our way and asked if there was any particular reason we'd chosen to sit where we had. I hadn't registered much at the time, but looking back, when I'd boarded and had been looking around for a seat, it was as though this place was the only one I could see. I don't remember even considering anywhere else. So perhaps something drew me to it. At any rate, Michelle didn't expand any further at the time, and we went on our way, enjoying the rhythm of the train and savouring the excitement of heading off into the dark valley, full of stories, history, and ghosts. And we had plenty of all three as we wended our way along the line, disembarking at each station, where Jill and Michelle would fill us in on the history, stories, and the paranormal experiences relating to each location. We were given equipment such as EMF detectors and dowsing rods to try, and of course, we'd taken our own audio equipment. we were able to have time to attune to the ambient sounds, including the quite eerie cry of owls, natural shadows and atmosphere of each location before we started to investigate. Something that I feel made a huge difference to the experience. Sometimes on paranormal events, I don't feel like you're able to settle into the location first, to get a feel for it before you start using the equipment. I think being able to do this allows you to much more easily pick up on changes in the environment. At one point, Fitz and I thought we saw movement looking down towards the end of the platform. But we couldn't be sure if it wasn't just a shadow being cast from one of the staff members on the train, which had pulled away down the line beyond the platform's end to give us some quiet from the noise of the engine. Some others, though, saw much more obvious movement on a different occasion. This time, straight across the tracks, looking out from the platform where they saw the movement of a shadow. And this time, there was nobody in the vicinity that could have caused the movement. Unfortunately for us, we were looking in the other direction at the time. A particular bugbear of mine with some investigations, organised or otherwise, is investigators hassling for answers, asking the same questions over and over again as though any spirits present are performing monkeys to command. But thankfully, this was absolutely not the case here. The calling out during vigils felt natural and fluid. The questions evolved with the responses we were getting. The fact that the real history of the place was woven into the investigation made a huge difference, both because it felt more sympathetic and respectful, but honestly, it got more results. On a number of occasions, Jill and Michelle would be telling the story of a particular character from the railway's past, and the equipment all across the station would start to light up, seemingly in response to their story being told. The most intense experience we had of this kind was on the return journey. But just a little heads up here. If you're planning on going on a future Ghosts in the Valley event, just skip ahead the next couple of minutes and save this for later, because I don't want to spoil anything for you guys. Just outside the last station, the train came to a purring halt, and then the lights were turned off. We were given LED candles and got out the equipment once again for one last investigation. Not a station this time, but the train itself. It turned out we were indeed on a ghost train, and the carriage we were all riding on was haunted. More than that, a particular seat of this carriage was haunted. And I'm sure you've all figured this out by now. It was the seat that Fitz and I had been sitting in all evening. As we sat listening to Jill tell us the stories of the train, we had the equipment ready. And as she started telling us about one particular character, the one they thought was responsible for haunting the seat we were currently in, our EMF detector went off. And it went off, and it went off, and it went off continuously for at least a full 5 minutes, maybe more, and it didn't let up until Jill had finished telling the story of the ghost whose seat we had taken. And so we want to thank Haunted Heritage and Ecclesbourne Valley Railway for an absolutely fantastic evening, and we would highly recommend it if you do get a chance to go. And I believe the event will be back on by popular demand this coming autumn.
It was a fantastic night, and I can highly recommend it. I'll be putting a link on the website to Haunted Heritage. You should definitely check them out, and if you get an opportunity to go for it, and let us know how it turns out.
Well, I think it's now time for some listener stories, and this first one is from Kelly, who's done a fantastic job of recording the story herself.
Hi Lil and Fitz, this is Kelly Bear. I really enjoy your podcast and spooky stories in general. I would class myself as something of a skeptic, but I still enjoy being spooked. But I do have quite a few stories and experiences that I've had over the course of my almost 40 years. So I thought I would just tell you one of them today. And if you would like more, I can always send in more. So the first one I wanted to tell you was one that I actually had witnesses to, or a witness to. Well, you'll see more once I tell the story. Years and years ago, when I was with a different partner, I was staying over at his house, which he shared with another guy. And we were all staying up late. I remember it being a Friday evening. I remember that much. And my boyfriend at the time's flatmate said, I'm really exhausted. I think I'm going to turn in. So I said, okay, we said goodnight to him. And as he got up to go out of the living room, I also got up to go to the kitchen, which was attached to the living room. It had like a little breakfast bar and sort of a little nook. And so as I walked straight across the room to go to the kitchen, he walked across the room and then turned right to go out of the living room door. And then down, there was like 4 steps. I think it was like 3 or 4 steps. Oh, excuse me, car horn. Don't know if you heard that. Down the few steps and turn right into his bedroom at the bottom of the hallway. And as he had gotten to the bottom of the steps, I had reached the point where I could also see out of the living room door. And as he went into his bedroom, I saw just out of the corner of my eye a sort of dark shadowiness follow him into his bedroom. And I was like, I am so tired. And I said to my boyfriend at the time, because he was like, are you okay? Because I think I sort of went a bit quiet and looked a bit puzzled. And I said, I thought I just saw someone follow him into his bedroom, but like a shadow. And he's like, you're probably just tired seeing things. I said, yeah, probably right. Anyway, fast forward to, we had gone to bed as well, my boyfriend at the time and I. And I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning at this point, and we hear his flatmate yelling, and we're like, I'm a really light sleeper anyway, but I was awake in a flash, thought something was wrong. My ex, I think he grabbed something. I don't know if he had a baseball bat or something by the side of his bed. I don't know. I grabbed something. We thought someone was in the house. We tore open his bedroom door, and the doors were directly next to each other on right angles. So we then barged into his flatmate's bedroom door, and we found his friend sort of just in the corner of the room, just yelling and sort of freaking out. Obviously, we'd put the light on, going, where is it? What's wrong? And he said that he had woken up in the middle of the night and thought that someone was standing over him, like a dark shadow was standing over him at the bottom of his bed. And he was completely freaked out. And for a second, he did actually think that a person was in his room. But then he realized that it wasn't, because as he could it sort of moved really quickly. I don't know I can't quite remember. This was quite a long time ago. It was at least 10 years ago, if not maybe, I'm trying to count back how old I am. Maybe about 12 years ago now. I just remember him being really, really freaked out. And he had seen this dark, shadowy thing. And my boyfriend turned to me and just looked as pale as anything, because I had said I had seen this dark shadow follow his friend into his bedroom when he'd gone to bed. Part of me does think the two are just coincidences. I was just tired and seeing things out the corner of my eye, and that his flatmate, my boyfriend at the time's flatmate, was experiencing sleep paralysis, because I've had sleep paralysis myself a few times, and it is horrible. It is horrendous. But there's that little doubt in the back of my mind because of the two going together quite nicely. So who knows? Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe it was something spooky going on. But that flat that they lived in, my goodness, so many weird things happened in that flat. I could probably keep going all evening, but I won't. I will leave you with that little nugget today, and maybe I will send in some more at a later date. Thank you for your podcast. It's so much fun. I love the sort of historic element to it too. I love that you go and visit these places, and I look forward to the next episode. Take care, guys. Bye.
Thank you, Kelly Bear, for sharing that story with us. It's a really interesting one. Now, as you know, I'm rather fond of my skeptic hat.
I knew you were going to bring that up.
Yeah, so I'm donning it now. As you say, there's always the chance that your eyes are playing tricks on you and that it's sleep paralysis and la 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 la. But I do find it very interesting that, like you say, it both happened in the same evening. And you mentioned when you walk in that your flatmate was cowering in the corner of the room. Now, I've had sleep paralysis before and I wasn't able to move. That's the whole paralysis bit, obviously. So I don't know whether it was just the time you took to get into the room, because obviously it fades fairly quickly, so you can then move.
Yeah, I was going to say, to play devil's advocate just for a minute, which is unusual for me, let me put my skeptic's hat on for a moment. I know.
Brush the dust off.
No, you're quite right. I've had sleep paralysis, and as you say, it is horrible. So I can imagine that once it has faded and sort of released you from the paralysis part of it, you might well scramble out of bed and get yourself into a sort of protective position. I can see that being that happening.
Yeah, so I'd be interested to know if you can sort of let us know whether that might have been the case or not. But also the fact that you said there's lots of other things that went on in the house and blah, blah, blah. It's like, when you start adding these things up, it makes you wonder.
Yeah, so to fling my skeptic's hat truly off into a distant corner, for me, but then this is me, the fact that you saw the shadow figure preceding this event and then your flatmate had the experience and you mentioned that there's lots of other things going on, that would just be too much of a coincidence for me.
Yeah, I'd like to investigate that place.
And we'd certainly love to hear the rest of those stories, please.
Oh, definitely, yes. Please do share the rest with us. We'd love to hear them.
Okay, well, next up we have a story from Chris, who wrote in to tell us what happened on his holiday.
All my life, I've seen ghosts, and I seem to be quite sensitive to them. I can go into a building and tell whether it's haunted or not. About 10 years ago, myself and my wife went to Centre Parks for a short break. We'd been looking forward to this break for months, but as soon as we got to our cabin, strange things started to happen. We unpacked and realised that we hadn't brought a corkscrew with us. I went off to the local shop to pick one up, but when I arrived back, I found my wife quite pale and shaking. I asked her what was wrong, and she went on to tell me that she saw me walking into the cabin and then fade away. Minutes later, I actually arrived back to the cabin. We discussed this for a while, thought it was very strange, and then settled down to watch a little TV with a glass of wine. But the TV volume kept going up and down noticeably on its own. We thought it might have been an electrical problem, but then my wife joked saying, the TV channel will probably turn over next, and it did. After that, things died down for a night or two. On the final night we were there, we went to bed early because we had an early start in the morning. Halfway through the night, we woke up and the room was absolutely freezing. There seemed to be this black cloud hovering over the bed. I raised my hand and passed it through the cloud. Even though the room was cold, the cloud was even colder. I had a really horrible feeling from it, and it actually made me feel slightly sick. Why we stayed in the room for the rest of the night, I'll never know. We just pulled the blanket over our heads, cuddled together, and waited for the morning to arrive. Somehow we even managed to go to sleep at some point in the night. When we woke up the next morning, the room was lovely and warm, and the feeling of nastiness had completely disappeared. We were so grateful that that was our last night staying there. We packed up the car with speed and left. Like I said at the start, I've seen and felt many ghosts over the years. Very few have felt nasty, but this was one of them.
And thank you to Chris for sharing his story with us. And Vardoga's coming up again.
For those of you that haven't listened to previous episodes, Vardoga is basically the sort of ghost of somebody that's still alive that comes home just before they do.
And it just keeps cropping up. We've had it happen to us. Lots of listeners have been getting in touch and telling us that they've had similar experiences. And here we have another one. One other thing that I'm sort of starting to notice now, the Vardoga phenomenon is sort of a self-contained phenomenon. But in our experiences, and in the case of lots of listeners' experiences, there seem to be other paranormal things going on in tandem.
Yeah, I mean, we've had some other stuff going on around here, and I never realised these were so common.
No.
You know, I'd kind of heard about them before, but no idea that they were so common.
And so many instances we're hearing about now where it's not just that that's happening. So, you know, a Vardoga is an apparition of a person that is still alive, but there seems to be something else going on along with these experiences that is, I don't know whether it's separate or how intertwined it is. It's really interesting though.
Yeah, I'm going to start selling blankets though.
Blankets?
Yeah, he does the traditional, we cuddled up, put the blanket over our heads to protect us from demons and carried on.
Demon protective blanket. I've done that many a time. I've been there.
It's amazing the amount of comfort it does give you though, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I still sleep like a cocooned, sausage wrapped blanket, my demon away blanket.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to sell coffee protective blankets.
Definitely, I would buy that.
Yes, you say you don't know why you stayed the night, and having been in a similar situation, I can understand why you don't. You've got to pack the car, you're hundreds of miles away from home, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. You know, unless your life is literally in danger, then I can see why you just grin and bear it.
Yeah, it is easy to think that after the event. You know, it's easy to look back and think, gosh, why on earth didn't we just leave? But no, it's not that simple. In fact, we have been in a similar situation. We were on holiday once in a rented house, and it was a really creepy place. And several times, just as I was trying to get to sleep, I'd hear footsteps on the stairs. I'd literally see something rattling the doorknob. It would shake. And I just basically blocked it out and pretended it wasn't happening.
Plus, we're not rich. If we're on holiday and I've paid for it, I'm getting my money's worth.
Exactly. Ghosts or no.
Well, we'll be looking for ghosts now.
Well, yeah. This was a long time ago.
Yeah. Now we're like, oh, there was no ghost. It was rubbish.
Yeah, exactly. If we went on holiday and found that now, we'd be getting the equipment out.
So thank you again to Chris for sharing your story. It sounds like you've got quite a few more stored up, so do share some more with us if you get the chance. We move on now to our next listener story, and this one is from Juliet.
When I was in 5th grade, my mother started to look for a home for my parents to purchase. We'd been renting houses in Southern California for almost 10 years after emigrating from Great Britain via Canada. Mummy had a laundry list of features that the home had to have. 4 bedrooms, a formal dining room, a large kitchen, fireplaces, a scenic view, large garden, plenty of space for all of us to expand into. We were just 2 kids and 2 parents, and Mummy's list was all the more odd because we were not wealthy, and the requirements were a bit on the costly side. But in a matter of a few months, Mummy informed us that she had located the house, and we would be moving into it in less than 2 months. It consisted of 4 bedrooms and a living room that ran the complete length of the front of the house, about 50 feet by 12 feet, with a fireplace at both ends. A formal dining room, 3 butler's pantries off the kitchen, a small glass conservatory, ceilings 14 feet high, a fancy chandelier, and a rather stately and ornate staircase that led up to the bedrooms. I don't think I knew it was an odd house on that first day, but my mother did. My memory was that I did not like to go into it by myself due to the sounds, but with moving in and out with boxes and all of our friends helping with the move, it was a huge undertaking. At one point, my mother stayed in the house while the rest of us, me, my brother and father, returned to the old house to get another load. Mummy was at the kitchen sink rinsing out some things when she thought she saw someone walk past her through to the butler's pantry and into the formal dining room. She said, "Hello?" But there was no answer. She went to the pantry and saw the swing door moving as though someone had just passed through. She followed into the dining room. No one was there, so she went quickly out to the hallway and into the living room. Finding this empty too, she checked the front door. It was locked. She gave up the search then, but felt a bit concerned. We came back with another load of boxes, and the unpacking began in earnest. I think that was the first clue that we were not alone in the house. The house was a home built by a physician who handled cases of consumption, or TB as we know it now, which was a fatal disease at that time. The house was built in 1883, and the man's name was Dr. Fletcher. The property was 3/4 of an acre when we got it, but it had been on 6 acres with small homes surrounding it and a barn. Patients had lived in the little cottages surrounding the doctor's house, where they no doubt passed away seeking a cure from tuberculosis. When we lived there, the foundations of the small houses were left. I even built a rock garden in one of the cement areas, but that's another story. The haunting was mild at first. We attributed the odd sounds to the relaxing of the redwood as the temperature changed from the hot Southern California day to the much cooler evenings. The house was 100% redwood, with lath and plaster and casement windows with weights that lifted up the windows installed behind the carved casements. The doors in the house had beautiful brass fixtures and obsidian knobs. The staircase was beautiful and had a double window seating arrangement for one to rest midway up the stair to the main landing. But it required such a lot of time to clean. The home had been built for an era of servants and only loosely upgraded. The master baths had all modern features, but the kitchen needed to be updated. The electricity in the home had been added after it was built. One year we went up to the attic. You had to climb through the ceiling, so it wasn't easy access, and we found abandoned tools from workmen who left them when installing the electrical circuitry for the lights. I always closed my bedroom door at night. I think it was to keep them out. As time rolled on, and more things happened, all of us in the house did that. So, what did I experience in the house? Where to begin? Footsteps outside my door, and no one there once I opened the door onto the landing. Knocking at my door late into the night, and no one there. Horses' hooves outside on the driveway at 1 a.m, and nothing to be seen. Carriage wheels outside on the steps below, nothing there. Objects moving across the desk with no explanation how it happened, and frankly scaring the bejesus out of me. Deep grumbling voices coming out of the kitchen wall. My brother experienced this and bolted upstairs when he heard it. We'd hear the sound of a small child, sometimes laughing and sometimes crying, and the sound of 2 adults arguing, but the voices would stop the moment you entered the room. We also saw a large orb light that went up the stairs, but this was in broad daylight. And a small child on the stairs, sitting, listening to my father read my sister a story. Doors that moved with or without wind, at one time closing in unison, after I'd asked that whoever was there to keep the peace while I was alone with my grandmother for the weekend. As the rest of the family drove up the driveway, the doors banged upstairs. Apparently, they felt that they'd kept their end of the bargain. And cold spots. Plenty of cold spots. an Indian penny that dropped out from the middle of the ceiling after I uttered, "I never get anything," for having to help my brother clean his room for the umpteenth time. Late one night, my father was lying with his hands and arms outside of the covers in the master bedroom. He was in that awake asleep state and heard a small child's voice say, "Daddy," and short little steps on the floorboards that walked up to the side of the bed. My father, thinking it was my younger sister, said, "Verity, go back to bed." The steps then stopped. Another, "Daddy," and an ice-cold small hand grabbed my father's arm. He bolted up in the bed, but there was nothing there. Late one night, my mother woke my father up and pointed to the etching of Stirling Castle. It was on the wall parallel to the top of the bed on the left side, nearer to my mother. It was tipping back and forth on the wall, a very dramatic movement. My parents watched it for 5 minutes and noted that there was no reason for this to be happening. No logical one, anyway. So Dad uttered, "Eve, just take it off the wall and we can go back to sleep." Getting any goosebumps yet? In 1972, my grandmother came from Scotland to live with us in the house, and for the first year she was bedridden in our formal dining room, which we'd turned into a bedroom as she could not climb the stairs. After a few months, Gran kept asking if my sister Rhonda, who was 2 at the time, had come down in the night. She was hearing a little girl's voice. Sometime in the next several years, the hauntings became greater than just sounds, and one night, a full spectre appeared to her. It was a child of maybe 10 years, with a bow at the top of her head and a low-waisted dress. She was missing legs. She glided into the hallway, and my grandmother saw her through the open bedroom door. Over the years, the hauntings were all over the place, and we all accepted them. The overnight guests would remark about the little girl in the hallway, the odd sounds of furniture moving, talking, but we couldn't hear what was being said. It was all normal to us. And then my mother decided that we would be selling the house. We'd been there for 11 years. The last night I spent in the house, we sold it in 1978, I said goodbye to the things in the house. I asked them to give the next owners a little hell and walked out the door. You see, my deal with them was that I never saw them because I knew they were there. I didn't need to be shown. The new owners left within 2 years. They had a few bizarre episodes. The major one being a breakdown of the plumbing when they first moved in. The kitchen sink blew out its faucets and flooded the kitchen, causing them to have to remodel immediately. About 6 years after we moved out, I returned one night to show the house to an old beau. He'd been told all the stories. I drove up. I was driving a 380Z with the large hatch windows and parked on the street. The windows allow for little obstruction in viewing things from the car. I looked up at the house and saw the big windows, and I felt the gaze of the house. I could feel the acknowledgement of my presence coming from the house that night. Then the beau said, "I want to leave." "But we just got here." But I started the engine and pulled from the curb. "Why did you want to go when we'd just arrived?" I got creeped out when that little girl came to the door window. "What little girl?" "Cut it out, you saw her." "No, I didn't." I have visited the house when I'm in Los Angeles. The property is in great shape and is currently being restored and expanded by a person in the film industry. When I visit, I can still feel them. I know they know it's me. We've not grown apart.
And thank you to Juliet for sharing that story with us. that was really amazing. Do you know what, though? The first thing that struck me was the point at which they got to that stage where it's just like, nah, it's just a ghost.
It's just normal.
Yeah, it just happens.
I kind of recognise that from our haunted house. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, not every experience they had sort of chimed with what I've been through, but so many of them, just like, yeah, I know that feeling. I know the situation where it's like, just get on with it, ghost. Take the picture off the wall, stop it knocking.
Yeah. I loved that. Just take it off and then it can't move it anymore. We can go back to sleep. I like that.
Yeah. There is something about children ghosts, though. Children scare me at the best of times, but if it's not actually a child, it's a ghost and it's like, Daddy?
That was a particularly creepy encounter, yeah.
Oh, it's making the hair stand up on my arms just thinking about it now. Oh.
I kind of recognised what she was saying about that sort of feeling of connection with the house, though. And it's one thing when you're living with it, but after you've moved out, that connection doesn't necessarily go away. It seems to stay with you, and I think that was definitely the case for Juliet by the sounds of it.
Yeah, there's certain places where stuff just happens occasionally and there doesn't seem any rhyme or reason to it, and there's other places where it's like this, where it seems to react to you, respond to you,
and almost become a part of family life in a strange way.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was getting to, where it's kind of like they are part of the family and, they miss you and you miss them. And yeah, I got that impression that by the end it was kind of just like, I don't want to see you because that would scare me, but I kind of appreciate your presence.
Yeah, and when I hear these kinds of stories, it sort of makes me wonder what it would be like if we could go back to our old haunted house at some point. And I think it's something that plays on your mind occasionally as well. Like, what would it be like? Would they react to us? Would they remember us? Would we get that kind of feeling of connection again?
Oh, I don't know. I'd love to investigate it, but I never got to that stage where I felt comfortable with it. So I don't know if it would now. I think I'd still be terrified in that place.
Yeah, but it's an interesting one to think about.
Yeah, that place, I'll never forget it. I've been to lots of haunted places. I've lived in lots of places that are supposedly haunted, but that was the one place where I consistently felt uncomfortable a lot of the time. Whereas
here, in this house, I think we've got more of that sort of sense of it just being part of us, part of our life, part of the house, and almost kind of wonder if it's okay when it's not happening.
Yeah, and it's sporadic, and when it happens, it might give you a jump at the time, but it never really feels particularly ominous, other than that weird thing I had with the cats the other week ago. But recently, no, it felt a bit spooky at the time, but it's not kept me up or anything.
No. So thank you so much to Juliet for sharing your experiences with us. And thank you so much to all of the listeners that sent in their stories for this episode. Your stories are the heart and soul of this show.
And if you've got a story that you'd like to share, please do get in touch through our website at knockOncevs.com.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the stories we've got time for today. But never fear, it's time for the paranormal postcard. So grab yourself a cuppa, settle in, get comfy, while we tell you about our spooky adventure to Thetford.
It was a drizzly and cool British day when we visited Thetford Priory. It wasn't an entirely unplanned visit, but we'd not researched the site in detail, and were dropping in as we were going to be nearby. I was expecting to see a few tumble-down stones in a field, and perhaps some plaques or information boards describing how the building would have looked, that with a bit of imagination and following the dips and swells of the earth might give some impression of what once stood on the site. I was to be pleasantly mistaken. Pulling up into the car park, I was surprised to see a considerable amount of the building was still standing. However, it was not until we actually made our way onto the site that the scale of the building started to become apparent. Even looking back now over the photographs we took of our visit, they failed to entirely capture the sheer scale of some of the remaining stonework. It wasn't just the size of the ruins that were to impress me either. Stepping from the path and approaching the ruins, I had the electrical feeling that I often experience at haunted locations, and it intensified as I got closer. Though it was overcast and gently raining, the day was clear, but I felt as if I should be experiencing a fog or mist. My mind too seemed fogged, and I had the feeling that another vision of this place was trying to superimpose itself on what I was actually seeing. My mind struggled with the conflicting feelings of being in a wide open space open to the elements, while simultaneously feeling that I was inside of a grand structure. And in its heyday, it would very much have been a grand structure, one of the largest and richest religious buildings in East Anglia, in fact. Founded in 1103 by Roger Bigod, who was a Norman knight that was part of the invading forces of the Norman conquest and an associate of William the Conqueror. The Cluniac Priory of Thetford was initially housed on the abandoned cathedral church of the East Anglian bishops. The original site was constrained by surrounding buildings preventing expansion, and so after petitioning the king, they were granted the more open site on which the remains of the Priory of Our Lady of Thetford now stand. Roger designed the priory in the style of the Cluniac order, which is to say that it was of a magnificent scale and of a rich architectural style. Sadly for Roger, he was never to see the priory he designed. On the 1st of September 1107, just outside of Thetford, Roger laid the foundation stone of what was to become one of the most impressive religious buildings in medieval East Anglia. By the 9th of September, he was dead. The monks of Thetford claimed his body, as was his wish, to be buried at the priory. But the Bishop of Norwich stole his body in the middle of the night and had him buried at the cathedral he had built in Norwich. Following Roger's death, work continued on the priory and the presbytery was completed by around 1114, allowing a community of monks to take up residence. The nave took perhaps another 60 years to complete, and the site as a whole was adapted and expanded throughout the Middle Ages. It followed a typical monastery layout, arranged around a central cloister with access off covered walkways into the main buildings, including the church, refectory, dormitory and chapter house, with an infirmary extending out from the core of the monastery. In addition to this, there were several freestanding buildings such as barns and stables that were required as a part of the running of the monastery, and the whole site was enclosed by a stone wall. The priory was also to gain notoriety in the middle of the 13th century as the site of miraculous healing. A local artisan suffering an incurable illness was told in multiple dreams by the Blessed Virgin that he would regain his health if he could convince the prior to build a lady chapel on the north side of the church. The prior was willing and began to build a timber chapel, but the artisan was adamant that the building should be of stone. Further visitations convinced the prior, and work on the stone building began. Looking to furnish the new chapel cheaply, the prior found an old wooden image of the Virgin at the site of the original chapel across the river, which had been stored after one of greater beauty was installed at the new church. The image was given to a painter to be restored, but during the course of his work, he found that the image contained a variety of precious relics, which had been sent from the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem at the request of Hugh Bigod, Roger's second son. Once the image had been restored by the painter and the relics reinterred within it, the priory suddenly became known for miraculous cures, including 2 accounts of children being returned from the dead. Whether you believe in miracles or not, the otherness and unusual feeling of the place is undeniable. Walking the length of the presbytery, it was easy to see in my mind's eye the impressive grandeur of the place. It's difficult to describe the scale of the nave, and to assist I'll upload some images to the website of when I asked Lil to walk to the far end so I could take some photographs to convey the scale. It wasn't until she became a tiny speck in the distance that I was able to truly appreciate how big this would have been. And as I stood there, the feeling that I wasn't quite seeing what I was meant to be seeing, the feeling of something more just under the surface heightened. As Lil was walking through the ruins, seeming to examine each area carefully, I was drawn quickly to the rear of the site, where the more intact Prior's lodging still stood. The feeling of pressure and electricity was heightened here, and as I took it all in, I suddenly saw what appeared to be a hooded figure in black at one of the upstairs windows. It appeared to be walking past the window, and as it did so, it glanced in my direction. I didn't see it in any great detail, but it was almost entirely dark in colour, and I didn't see any sign of a face. Thinking that maybe someone was working on the building and that a dark hooded jacket or poncho wouldn't be amiss in the drizzly weather, I headed towards the large arched doorway. As I did so, the static electrical feeling that I'd been having across the site intensified, and the hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stood up. That was until I crossed the threshold of the arch, and the feeling almost seemed to pop. It wasn't entirely gone, but was greatly lessened, and the foggy, distracted feeling I'd been having was also much reduced. Slightly more clear of mind, it didn't take long to realise that the figure I'd seen was no workman. The stairs leading up to the first floor had mostly gone, but more importantly, there was no longer a floor above me. What presumably would once have been a wooden first floor was completely gone, and I could see clearly through to the sky above me. At this point, excited about my experience, I was keen to get Lil's impression of the building. I could see she was making her way over to me, so I went back outside to where I'd initially seen the figure. When she arrived, I was careful not to share what had happened immediately, and asked her what her impressions were of the building. She described a similar feeling to myself, so I suggested she walk towards the building and let me know how it felt. Like I had, she reported that the feeling increased in intensity until crossing the threshold, where it lessened considerably.
It was almost as though there was a kind of electrical charge which stretched in a band across the tall arched entrance to the Prior's lodgings. You could feel it as you walked through and out the other side. I hadn't yet got my bearings or worked out what this part of the building was, so I didn't make the connection until Fitz told me what he'd seen. I knew he hadn't done any research on the site beforehand, so when he related what he'd seen, I was pretty stunned by the similarities to an experience documented by respected paranormal researcher and member of the Society for Psychical Research, C.J. Romer. When I first started researching Thetford, I was a bit confused to find references to the Priory appearing on an episode of Ghost Hunters. Now, it took me some time to realise that this episode was from the UK 90s TV series Ghost Hunters, all one word, and not to be confused with the American Sci-Fi Channel series of a similar name. On this episode, C.J. Romer relates his experience at Thetford Priory, which sparked his interest in ghosts and inspired him to pursue a career in the paranormal. On a mild August evening in 1987, Romer and some friends stopped off on the drive home to Bury St Edmunds and found themselves near Thetford Priory. Wondering why they'd never come across it before, they decided to explore a little, but were surprised to find it deserted on such a pleasant summer night and so close to a built-up area. They expected to encounter children playing or dog walkers, but found the place quite lonely. As they stood admiring the facade of one derelict building, they noticed through a small first-story window someone was watching them. They saw the figure pass by the window and begin to descend the staircase below, which was visible through an arched doorway. They could make out that the figure seemed to be wearing some kind of billowing black robe, and one of them, wondering if they were being pranked, remarked that it must be someone wearing a black sheet and pretending to be a ghost trying to scare them. Quite put out by this, they started towards the doorway, at which point the figure began to retreat back up the stairs. By now convinced that this was some kind of practical joke, two of the group, including Roma, in a decision he describes as being in the spirit of Scooby-Doo, decided to give chase and charged toward the staircase to turn the tables on the Joker. Roma described how he felt he had actually ascended the first couple of steps at a run when he suddenly pitched and smashed straight into the flint wall. His friend came in behind him also at a run and also ended his charge in a collision, having shot past the stairwell and into the back wall. Picking themselves up off the floor, bruised and bleeding, they realised that not only had the figure vanished, but so too had the staircase they had clearly seen moments before and had physically tried to climb. In fact, not only was there no staircase, there was also no floor in the first story above them, and the room with the window at which they'd seen the figure was open from the ground to the sky. Now, clearly recognising the description of the location of this event as very plainly being the building right in front of me, my jaw dropped a little as the gears in my brain churned and I realised that Fitz had seen the same apparition in the same window. There was the derelict staircase, and the first story window he'd seen the figure in, the floor below long since fallen through. Interestingly, CJ Roma and his friends were quite scientifically minded, and one of the first things they agreed to do after the strange event was to write down independent accounts of what had happened so that they could compare notes without biasing each other's story. The accounts were unquestionably similar, although with some interesting variations on the clarity of the detail. Roma, for example, described what he saw as a figure in a black sheet, or possibly a woman in an 18th century dress. This impression he got because of the billowing nature of the black fabric. Whereas his friend saw enough detail to be able to pin down the costume to that of a monk's habit, with a cowl pulled up and his hands clasped in the sleeves. Another didn't see a figure at all, but a column of black smoke or mist, which grew larger and seemed to glow. Another detail that featured in Roma's report was that he could see 3 dark spots in the stomach area of the figure, which seemed to shine darkly. After the strange events of that night, Roma started researching the history of the Priory, and one of the things he turned up was a murder. The first prior of Thetford, Prior Stephen, was apparently committed to using his position for good. But around the year 1240, a new prior, another Stephen, was appointed. But where the first prior had worked for good, the second focused his energy in quite the opposite direction and soon made himself universally hated. He bragged about his claim that he was some relation to the Queen and seemed to feel this excused him from any or all of his duties, regularly missing matins, mass, and generally not bothering to attend services at all. He refused to help the poor and even let the other monks go hungry, while he and his 2 cohorts, one of whom earned himself the nickname Clericus Monstruosus, ate their food, all the while sneering at and insulting them. He's reported to have turned the priory into a house of ill repute, drinking and carousing all night long. This continued until 1248, when he started picking on a fellow monk who had not long since arrived at the priory. This turned out to be Stephen's undoing, as the monk had a hot temper and wasn't about to stand for the prior's abuse. The two got into a heated argument. The monk flew into a rage and stabbed Prior Stephen, who died just outside the great west door of the church, just behind the prior's lodgings. Now, I couldn't track down an account of this murder that wasn't from a fairly contemporary source, but according to some accounts I've read, who I'm sure have probably done more in-depth research than me, Prior Stephen was stabbed several times in the stomach, which to me makes a very interesting connection to the dark, shining spots that Roma witnessed around the stomach area of the dark figure he saw. This strange incident isn't the only time phantom monks have been sighted around the priory, however. There have been many reports over the years of visitors seeing dark figures perambulating the ruins, and they all seem to have a few things in common. All of the accounts describe the monks wearing habits with their head bent or cowls pulled up to obscure any facial features. They all describe that the monks have their hands clasped together, meaning that their hands are hidden by the sleeves, just as Roma's group described. And they all describe the monks looking so solid that they appear just like real people. In fact, many have thought them to be reenactors. One visitor who was there with her daughter followed the solid-looking figure around a wall, only to discover he'd disappeared once she reached the other side. There are even accounts of visitors attempting to speak to the apparitions, thinking that they were just people in costume. According to these reports, the dark figures simply vanished when spoken to. Another common phenomenon, which has been reported at the Priory from as early as the 1930s, is the ghostly sounds of singing and Latin chanting carrying through the empty ruins. Although we think of priories as places of peace and worship, medieval England was a dangerous time to be alive, and even monks weren't immune to some of the horrors of the 14th century. In 1313, a vicious mob broke into the priory, and although the monks fled to the church for sanctuary, many were maimed or murdered in the ensuing violence. Maybe this trauma reverberated so deep within the flint walls that it still echoes around the ruins today. Another classic contributor to paranormal activity is the disturbance of graves, and Thetford can lay claim to this too. As with so many of the religious buildings we've come across in our travels, Thetford met its untimely end with Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. It very nearly survived after the Duke of Norfolk campaigned to Henry on the grounds that so many earls and dukes were buried there, including Henry's own illegitimate son. Henry initially agreed, but in classic Henry fashion suddenly changed his mind, and as a consequence, many of the tombs were dug up and the bodies reinterred elsewhere. Perhaps this disturbance of the graves has added to the energy of the place and caused a few unquiet spirits. For us at least, the centre of the activity seemed to be the prior's lodgings, and interestingly, that's the building which survived the longest, and in fact, the one that is still most intact today. Although the priory was suppressed in 1540, the prior's lodgings continued to be used as a private residence, and it wasn't abandoned until 1737. By 1820, it was in ruins, but maybe the continued use for so many years could explain why it seems to be such a paranormal hotspot within the site.
It is a really atmospheric site.
It is, and it did help that it was deserted. I was going to say basically deserted, but I don't think there was anybody else there all day, was there, when we visited?
I think perhaps one person walked along the path alongside it, but I don't think anyone else was in the ruins. But the best way I think of being able to explain how I was feeling when I felt like I was sort of having this image attempt to overlay itself. Do you remember those magic eye pictures?
Mm-hmm.
And you remember the moment before it snapped? Like you knew there was something in it, but you couldn't quite, you just sort of perhaps caught a corner of something or just a little snippet before it suddenly popped into your vision.
Yeah, no, I do know what you mean. For me, it was more like those sort of hologram things that you used to get in the 80s on cereal boxes and stuff, where you tilt the picture and it becomes sort of more 3D. It felt more like that to me, like I wanted to tilt the picture and it would sort of become more sort of dimensional somehow.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like, if you could just get yourself at the right angle, it would
You'd
suddenly
see
snap
it.
into focus. Yeah, it was really strange.
What's really interesting about that, actually, is if you can track down this video that we were talking about, where CJ Roma gives his experiences, do watch it. And one of the things that he talks about at the end is that when he and his friends were leaving the site, they had this odd sensation like the building was becoming more complete around them as they left. And I don't think I'm really doing what he explained justice, but it's quite a difficult concept to convey. But it reminded me of what we were feeling in a lot of ways, that there was more, that it was sort of trying to come out through to our reality somehow. It's very strange.
It was really strange. We watched the video when we got back. We didn't watch it before we went. I think because you'd read up about this before we went.
I had, but I didn't know the story in as much detail. I mean, Fitch, you hadn't done any research, so you knew none of this, and we split up as soon as we got to the site, so I hadn't told him anything. And I had read the account, but only in very bare detail. Before we went there, I just looked up in one of my sort of Ghost of Norfolk books, and I'd read one entry for the site, and I'd got the bare bones of this sort of experience, and that was all I knew. So it wasn't until later we tracked down this account, and it really blew our minds a bit, didn't it?
My jaw dropped when we were watching it because it was almost exactly what I'd experienced, and the same feelings as well. It was very much the vibe I got. It was the same window. It was the same kind of thing that I'd seen. It was just like, wow, okay, before I could have, written it off as just me feeling a bit strange and perhaps seeing something out the corner of my eye, but to have someone else basically recount exactly what I'd experienced was shocking. It really did stun me.
It did hit home a bit, didn't it? And even if you can't track down the video, CJ Roma does have his own blog, and we'll put the link in the show notes, because on that blog he has written out his first-hand account of the experience, so you can go and check that out for yourselves. Well, that's not quite all we've got time for today, so stay in your seats with your cup of tea just for a minute, because we've got another bonus paranormal postcard for you today.
Not far from Thetford Priory lies another supposedly haunted location. A few minutes by car, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that you'd stepped back in time. Surrounded on all sides by woods, the nearby road disguised by natural undergrowth, Thetford Warren Lodge stands alone in an undulating clearing. The leaden sky did much to enhance the spooky feeling that enveloped us as we stepped out of the coffeemobile. Built sometime in the 1400s, the austere-looking square building was constructed as a defensive lodge for hunting parties and the prior's warrener to repel poachers. The martial aspect of its design is readily apparent, with thick stone walls and few windows. The meat and fur of the rabbits was an important resource, and poachers were a threat to both rabbit and man. The warreners would live on the first floor and use the ground floor for storing traps, drying skins, and hanging salted meat. It's reported that the ghost of a man, faceless in some accounts or with an eerie-looking face in others, can often be seen looking out of the first floor windows. He was even once reported to be seen walking outside of the lodge. One terrified witness reported a man in blue and cream clothing, but with no face and just black holes for eyes and a mouth. The lack of a face and rumours of a leper colony in the area have led some to believe that this ghost may have been a leper, but others believe that it's the ghost of a warrener still protecting his rabbits, or even the spirit of a poacher killed in the course of his unlawful hunting. And yet, faceless men are not the strangest tale about the lodge. That particular accolade goes to the phantom rabbit. Monty Python fans may be disappointed to hear that it's not said to have nasty big pointed teeth. However, this huge spectral rabbit is said to have flaming red eyes, and is an omen of death for anyone that lays eyes upon it. Luckily, we encountered no rabbits, spectral or otherwise, and the lodge itself was fairly quiet. I did at one point think that I'd heard footsteps coming from the now missing first floor, but a little patient spectating soon revealed that the culprit was a family of nesting birds. In fact, I didn't really feel much from the building itself. The spooky feeling I'd had after arriving, now that I was at the lodge, seemed to be coming from the woods behind me. It's more than possible that this feeling was simply my overactive imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, particularly in the direction of an animal trail leading off into the woods. There was nothing obvious to see there, and as I'm sure most of you are aware, there aren't exactly any large predators roaming the English countryside that we might need to worry about. The feeling stayed with me the whole time we were there, and as we made our way back to the coffee-mobile, I couldn't help but wonder that should I return late one night and look back up the trail to the dark of the woods, might I see, looking back at me, the ghostly form of a large white rabbit with flaming eyes, a signal that I was not long to remain among the living.
And that, I'm afraid, is all we have time for this episode. Thank you so much to everyone who shared their paranormal stories with us. We love hearing about your experiences, and the show wouldn't be what it is without them. Thank you also to everyone who supports the show through Ko-fi and Patreon. We literally couldn't do this without you, and if you love the show and would like to help support us by sharing your paranormal story or by making a donation, you can find links on our website, knockonceforyes.com.
Don't forget to rate and review the show on your podcast provider of choice, and if you know someone that would enjoy the show, please do let them know about us. Thank you all for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time for another Knock Once for Yes.
If you please listen and